Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, India has come under pressure from a number of Western countries over its neutral stance on the conflict and its continual of purchasing oil and gas from Russia. Senior officials from both the West and Russia continue to engage to win a favor from India. What is the thinking behind the foreign policy of New Delhi, especially on the Ukraine crisis? Will India side with the West to put extra pressure on Russia or carry on its traditional friendship with Moscow despite opposition from Washington and Brussels? To find out more, I'm glad to be joined by Professor Madhav Nalapat, Vice Chairman of the Manipal Advanced Research Group, Rick Dunham, former White House correspondent for Business Week, and Pavel Felgenhauer, Russian defense analyst. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. I will start with Rick and Pavel, actually. Rick, tell us how important is Indian position? What does it mean to Washington in terms of this Ukraine crisis, in terms of probably this, let's say, this confrontation between Russia and the West?
Well, I think it's fair to say that Washington and the EU want to strangle Russia economically. And they see China and India as both the two largest countries in the world, but also economic outlets for Russia to make money, to keep getting rubles, and to fund the war effort. And they're trying to put pressure on diplomatically, behind the scenes, publicly, to try to get India to cut off the money that could help fund the war effort. And I mean, I think that it's a tough sell because of India's longtime alliance with Russia, dating back to Soviet Russia. But I think they're going to keep doing it because I think that Washington and the European countries, the Western European countries, see economics and economic strangulation of Putin's Russia as the only way to end the war in Ukraine.
Similar question for you, Pavel. How important is India to Russia in its confrontation with the West?
Well, India, of course, is important. India is a major trading partner. Yes, and during the Cold War, Russia and India or Soviet Union and India were very close strategically. And of course, it's not only oil, which Russia began selling massively to India during the 80s, using actually Iraqi oil, because we were selling lots of weapons to Saddam Hussein, who was fighting Iran, and he paid us in oil, and oil we didn't actually need. And so we shipped it from the Gulf to India, which is logistically easy. And then we were doing military cooperation and nuclear cooperation with Iran and continuing to do so. And again, Iran doesn't have money, pays in crude. We send the crude to India. Everyone's happy. And of course, right now, when the West is beginning to beginning to impose a possible oil blockade on Russia, Russia needs any customer who's going to buy our oil. And we're most likely going to be shipping it from much farther on, actually real Russian oil from the Far East and maybe even from Europe or from the north of Russia. So India, and of course there's also military cooperation with India, very important for India, important for Russia. It's a very complex relationship. The Indians always say that they have over 50% of their armaments, and in the army, it's 70% of the armaments is Russian-made or Russian or Soviet-made, and Russia helps to maintain those weapons in a battle-ready position. So it's very important, though of course we're not allies. Russia and India nowadays are not allies, but they're very important partners.
Very close relationship. Professor Nalapat, would you please summarize, for our audience, so far, what's the Indians' position in terms of the Ukraine crisis and also larger picture between Russia and the West?
Well, look, the fact of the matter is that energy is not part of the sanctions mechanism which has been put in place by the European Union, certainly, And as far as Washington is concerned, it has put sanctions on itself, but it has not done so on the Europeans quite correctly. The first point is oil and gas are not covered by sanctions. And this is what some people in the West are making a big fuss about. The second point is India's contribution to the total revenue of Russia from oil and gas is tiny compared to the contribution of the European countries, compared to the contribution of Italy or Germany or France or even England, frankly. India's purchase of Russian oil and gas comprised about 2% of our total demand. Maybe it can go to around 10%, 15% hopefully, because if we get cheap oil, we should get as much of it as possible. But as of now, it's a very tiny fraction of an amount. So that is why more and more people in India believe it's not a question of Indian money going to fund Putin's war machine. The Europeans are funding Putin's war machine abundantly, and especially now that gas prices are rising, oil prices are rising, they're funding it very generously. I think it's more a question, many of us in India believe, of wanting to break India and Russia apart. And we have been friends for 70 years. And somehow, the NATO countries don't like that, and they would like to make India and Russia, the friendship, fall apart. That's the whole purpose of trying to force India not to buy the ridiculously small amount of oil and gas compared to the European countries that it buys from Russia.
Yes.
I mean, I'm not going to call it hypocrisy. I'm simply going to say that possibly in school in the United States and in the European Union, they don't teach mathematics.
Well, Professor Nalapat, of course, probably that's why you see the active participation by the Indian netizens, in particular on Twitter, for example. There's a hashtag, stand with Putin, quite popular among Indian users. So, Rick, from your point of view, do you think Washington understand this sensitivity or the public sentiment among Indian people?
Yes, I mean, I think Washington, meaning the Biden administration and American policymakers, understand. I mean, they understand the India-Russia relationship. I mean, it goes back to Cold War days. It goes back to when China was fighting a war with Soviet Russia and India sided with Russia. It goes back to the time of Richard Nixon and Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, and India was fighting against Pakistan, and they saw the U.S. and China allying with Pakistan, and Russia was its strong ally. Russia and India have been friends, whether it was democratic Russia, whether it was Soviet Russia, or now Putin's new Russia, and they understand that. I will say policymakers do, as my colleague from India said, want to break that apart. But I mean, historical alliances like that, like China and Pakistan's, are hard to break. And so I think while they would like to do that, I think they understand that it's unlikely to happen.
But Rick, here's another question. U.S. Deputy NSA Dalip Singh, during his stay in India, he said, there are consequences to countries that actively attempt to circumvent or backfill these sanctions. What kind of consequences are we talking about? Do we have any idea? What will U.S. do if India continue to purchase oil and gas from Russia?
Well, I mean, I dare not say, but it sounds like this is a hollow threat, because I don't know what the United States really can do. It's just like with China. If China sends military equipment to help Russia replace some of the equipment that's been lost, if China tries to do this, if India tries to do it, I don't know what the United States can do. In theory, it could try to hurt trade relations. I just don't think that that's likely to happen, because U.S.-India trade relations have been good, have benefited both countries. I don't see it happening. I see the idea of threatening, of these vague threats, trying to get India not to buy more oil, But I also don't think that that's likely to happen either. India sees this as an opportunity. Russia is offering discounted oil. As my colleague from India has said, it makes economic sense for India to buy. And it's not a huge amount right now, but if Russia offers more, it makes sense for India to buy more. So, I mean, I think that you will hear rhetorical threats, but I don't think there's very much the U.S. can do. U.S. doesn't supply a lot of military aid to India that comes from Russia. So I think it will be mostly diplomatic posturing right now.
Professor Nalapat, Singh also said we are very keen for all countries, especially our allies and partners, not to create mechanisms that prop up the ruble and those that attempt to undermine the dollar-based financial system. It seems, in his words, in addition to a previous talk by President Biden, that India being somewhat shaky on pressuring Russia. So obviously, it seems to me like the proposed rupee-ruble mechanism, the payment mechanism, is the right line for Washington. Do you think, from New Delhi, does India also see it this way?
Well, look, we all know Joe Biden is a bit shaky sometimes in the things that he says. And the White House has got to basically apologize and go back, saying, oh no, he really didn't mean that, he meant something else. And I'm sure Biden regrets these references to India being shaky. The fact is, India has stood by a principled foreign policy for right from the beginning. In Vietnam, for example, we thought the United States was making a huge mistake. And ultimately, the gentleman who was one of the most nasty presidents where India was concerned, Richard Nixon, as has correctly been said by Rick, he had to admit that the Americans made a mistake. We believe the Americans made a big mistake in trying to arm terror groups in the guise of freedom fighters in Syria and create havoc. And today, those so-called freedom fighters are safe only in that part of Syria, not controlled by the Kurds or by Bashar Assad, whose government India has continued to recognize right through, despite pressure. So, this is nothing new. The reality of the situation is that we believe that this kind of an approach towards Russia is counterproductive, and it does not help the security of the Indo-Pacific at all. We do not understand how the United States, which has said that the 21st century belongs to the Indo-Pacific, suddenly Joe Biden goes back 50 years and says, no, it's really the 20th century. It's not the 21st century, it's the Atlantic, it's Europe. And so far as Europe is concerned, for Biden, it's only half of Europe. The other half is Russia. So what does he want to do? He wants to destroy the security of one half, which is Russia, and you think that's going to provide security in the other half? It's like the body. You make one part of the body diseased, and then you say the other part will be healthy. Both will become diseased, as Europe is now finding out. Do you feel the people of Hungary are siding with Putin? Do you think the people of Serbia are siding with Putin? Do you think all those crowds that are coming out and protesting against Olaf Scholz, who is behaving like a right-wing president, pretending to be a left-winger, or Macron, for example, or Boris Johnson, they're all friends of Putin? The reality is this war, the way it is being fought on both sides, is a disaster for both sides. And frankly, we don't want any part of it. One day, as in Vietnam, the Americans will understand they made a mistake. As far as the Europeans are concerned, well, I can only say that they are talking in terms of India coming around, but the reality is more and more of their own citizens are turning against their own governments because of the folly of the economic cost of this war. Mm-hmm. India, we have got excellent relations with Europe. We have got very good relations with the United States. The only tragedy is that the United States has elected a president who is 50 years behind the times. I don't know. I think personally that any other individual would have been probably better than Joe Biden, who is living in a time warp.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor Nalapat, of course, when the deputy NSA, Mr. Singh, used the word like there are consequences, when he speaks to the Indian or speaks to the Chinese, people from countries like India or China or other developing countries, who were once colonized or semi-colonized by the West. They are very sensitive to that, to how they are treated, whether they are treated equally, for example. And here, speak of the understanding of each other. There's this former UK National Security Advisor and Ambassador to the US, Kim Darroch, recently said in an interview that UK has a warm and fuzzy, quote unquote, warm and fuzzy view of India, but India is, quote, ruthlessly unsentimental. I want to have your opinion on that, Professor Nalapat. So do you think is that the way, or is that the way to conduct a relationship between, say, foreign policies, UK and India, or India with the West in general?
Well, look, frankly, I don't know this chap from Adam. Whoever came here, I've forgotten his name, and he has met some low-level officials. I don't believe he met a single high-level official, and he talked to people of his own level. God knows what he told them, and he made some irresponsible statements to the media, and frankly, we regard him as a joke. We regard him not with any kind of anger or whatever. This man is a walking joke, and he's symptomatic of the fact that the Biden administration sends somebody like this, who's so flat-footed, to deal with a country like India, which is absolutely essential to the United States in the security of the Indo-Pacific. The United States is essential to India, and we are essential to the United States. We know that, the United States knows that, but somehow this character has not got that particular lesson. And as far as the UK is concerned, Liz Truss, who I think is the Foreign Secretary of the UK, she came here. Well, we had a very busy schedule, but still I think our Foreign Minister spared some time to spend with her. God knows what she said, but on public she was very diplomatic. But she did not meet the Prime Minister. And we had another distinguished visitor from Russia, Sergei Lavrov, and the Prime Minister, despite his very busy schedule, had time to meet Sergei Lavrov. That tells you everything about what we believe to people who pressurize us. It's not a question of colonialism. It's simply a question of self-respect. Whether you're a big country or a small country, you should be treated with self-respect.
That's a good point. That's what I want to mention to Pavel, right? Pavel, when Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov was in New Delhi, and he was received by Prime Minister Modi, and if you compare, the reception with other foreign dignitaries, for example, from UK, from Germany, from the EU, from the US, from China, and Prime Minister Modi made no time to receive them, but he personally received Lavrov. People say that's a big statement.
Well, yes, it is. As I say, we're very close partners with India, though, of course, in recent years, Russia has very much increased its cooperation with Pakistan, too, because in Soviet times, during the Cold War, and sometimes after that, it was very kind of segregated. Pakistan was an unfriendly country. India was a very close friend. Now Russia is having balanced relationships with both countries. It's they say there's very important deals. It's not only selling oil, but it's also selling the S-400, giving India a modern air defense system, and that's what actually the United States could have sanctioned a long time before the Ukrainian crisis began, but decided not to. Because the United States sees the relationship with India also as very important in the context of China. So the United States doesn't really, there's a lot of talk about maybe punishing India, but I don't think that the United States is going to punish India. In no way, because of course there are very big American-Indian arms deals happening, and India increasingly depends on American military technology and on American know-how, especially in maritime warfare. And they don't want to break it up also, but they don't want to actually get involved in this absolutely in the Ukrainian thing, which for India is something happening far away in Europe, and it does not concern them much at all. And they would be, they're neutral, actually neutral, meaning neutral, and keeping very good relations with both sides, and they want to keep it so. And I don't think that the United States right now is going to try and break up its relations with India at all.
Well, Pavel, Lavrov said, during his stay in New Delhi, he said, we will be ready to supply India any goods which India wants to buy. I have no doubt that a way would be found to bypass the artificial unilateral sanctions which the West created, meaning basically you cannot use US dollar, you cannot use euro or UK sterling and pound sterling to purchase Russian oil and gas. So this ruble mechanism, do you think that that is possible, that is likely? The two countries will have a new payment system?
Well, that's a necessity because quite a number of contracts, and it's not only gas, it's not only oil, and it's not only weapons. It's many. India and Russia have a very important trading relationship, and some actually existing contracts became stranded because the Indian companies could not move money to Russia. Because of sanctions, because of problems with the SWIFT system, where Russia is, not all Russian banks are right now out of the SWIFT system, but some are. And so, yes, they're creating another, the creation began again before Ukraine, system to trade directly. There was one during the Cold War in Soviet times, because Russia, for its oil that it brought from the Gulf to India, was paid in rupees. And then these rupees were used to buy Indian goods, because India then was short of hard currency. So this is nothing new. And there's going to be, of course, right now the rupee is not a kind of unconvertible currency as it was then, and the ruble is also not so unconvertible as it was then. But there's going to be such a system in place. I believe there's going to be one between China and Russia too.
Yes. Yes. Right. So, Rick, do you think there's a concern, obviously, how much a concern in Washington, like if there's such a system, such a payment mechanism that will become workable between Russia and India, and then there will be increase in the purchase of oil and gas from Russia, and then probably that will somehow, as an example, like other countries will do the same?
Well, I would say for anti-Russia hardliners, you would call it a concern. To me, it's an obvious consequence of the sanctions. I mean, what is Russia going to do? It's obvious if Russia cannot deal in dollars or euros or pounds, Russia is going to have to try to figure out workarounds. And I mean, the question to me, so short term, yes, I see this with the RMB, with the rupee, who knows, with the South African rand, or other currencies for BRICS nations. But beyond that, I think that we could see, and this was forecast at the time of it was called the nuclear option with cutting off Russia from the Western financial system, that you are moving more toward two systems of finance, and one would be a basket of currencies that does not involve the dollar. And I see, this could be a temporary move just to keep Russia afloat, or it could be the beginning of a dual financial system in the world. And people in Washington may not be happy about that in the government, but it's a consequence. It's an obvious consequence of the sanctions.
Yes. And in response to the U.S. pressure, I would say, an Indian finance minister said, I will put my country's national interests, energy security first. Well, obviously, there's nothing wrong to put the national interests first. Professor Nalapat, it's also in every country, it seems to me, yes, we talk about the war, talk about being on the right side of history, but at the same time, national interests weigh a lot in decision making. For example, the U.S. efforts, like for example, to break the relationship between Russia and India, that's obviously will be in the interest of Washington, and for India to purchase more oil and gas at a discounted price, obviously is in the interest of India.
Well, there's absolutely no doubt about that, for the simple reason that it'll bring down inflation, And we are still a country with a lot of very poor people. I mean, we don't have the luxury of the per capita income of the Europeans or the Americans. And we are surprised that the White House, with Joe Biden in residence, is basically giving sermons to India and its poor people to become even poorer and to suffer even more than he is giving to his European partners. As far as I can tell, Biden is running around Europe, embracing every leader in sight, including those who are buying vast quantities of Russian oil and gas. So there's something, look, we have got excellent relations with the United States. India is critical to the US. US is critical to India. That's not going to be affected because you have somebody in the White House who is 50 years behind the times. The American system is very robust. Fortunately, it does not depend on the White House or the Grey House or the Black House or Blue House. It's a very widespread, diffuse system like India's is. So we're not really worried about our overall relationship with the US, but we are seriously concerned about the Biden administration, and especially after they send this absolute, I don't want to name, use some words in this channel, a totally undiplomatic individual to India who believed that, he was the master of India. God knows what he's read in his history books, but they're all wrong. And he has actually done a great disservice to his country, to the White House, by these stupid remarks. The only good news is we knew that he was just becoming stupid, and we didn't take it seriously, and that was the end of it. One or two officials reacted in a slightly amused manner, but that was it. But we haven't heard anything from that gentleman ever since. I mean, Nirmala Sitharaman, the very able finance minister of India, we haven't heard anything from this fellow after that. So I would like to believe that the United States, like the Europeans, like our Quad partners, understand the importance of India, and we understand their importance. And this kind of, if I may say so, temporary show of irrationality on the part of some people, I mean, it doesn't matter. The overall relationship is very sound because India and the United States is interested in a stable, secure Indo-Pacific, and we are partners in that. We are not going to jump around helping the United States in all the sometimes wrong decisions they take,
Professor
including
Nalapat,
on Ukraine or now recently in Afghanistan, when it left Afghanistan to the Taliban.
If you look at this oil purchase, for example, from Russia, not only India, but also European countries, including the United States itself, the latest, according to the Russian officials, the U.S. increased the crude oil supplies from Russia by 43% last week, over the past week. Besides, Washington allowed its companies to import mineral fertilizer from Russia and listing them as essential goods. What do you make of that? I find it less convincing by doing that. Well, U.S. asking other people, other countries, not to purchase more oil from Russia.
Well, look, there have been times in the 1990s, for example, Bill Clinton was very hostile to India. He wanted to denude India of its defensive systems. He wanted to denude India of a lot. But even during that time, any of us who went to Washington, we could find friends in the US Congress. We could find friends in the media. We could even find friends in the Clinton administration. So that's what we love about the United States. It's a very diffuse and diverse setup where no one person or one entity is in charge. And I think that's a great advantage the US has. That's a great advantage India has.
Okay, Professor, we have to
frankly,
stop there.
Look,
well, thank you, and
also
also Rick and Pavel. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks again to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thank you for being with us. See you next time.